Under the gray light of a foreign dawn, a line of defeated men walked through the fog, unaware that what waited beyond the wire would defy everything they had ever believed. They had been told the enemy was savage, that capture meant starvation, humiliation, or death. But when the gates closed behind them, they stepped into a world that would challenge not their loyalty to the Reich, but their understanding of what it meant to be human. December 19th, 1944. Snow and smoke mingled in the air as the last echoes of artillery faded in the Ardennes. The frozen forest lay broken and silent, littered with the remains of tanks, helmets, and burned-out trucks. German soldiers, once so certain of victory, now trudged through the ruins of their own defeat. Among them was a young man named Karl Hoffmann, 21 years old, his face hollow from hunger and exhaustion. His rifle was gone, his boots cracked, his spirit worn thin by the endless retreat. The war had drained him of everything except the instinct to keep walking. Around him marched hundreds of others, men who no longer looked at one another, men whose pride had frozen into silence. The road wound through the mist towards something they couldn't yet see. When they reached the open field, the sight stopped them cold. Fences, wooden towers, floodlights, guards. To their eyes, it looked like punishment, another version of what they themselves had built for their enemies. They expected dogs, beatings, hunger. The guards spoke English, sharp words they didn't understand. They saw trucks waiting, engines idling, and they thought perhaps this was only a stop before something worse. But there was no shouting, no violence, only a strange, practiced order. The prisoners were counted, searched, and led toward a line of tents. For the first time, Karl heard the word camp, spoken in a tone that was not cruel. The days that followed blurred together. The prisoners were loaded onto ships bound for America. When the waves rose high over the gray Atlantic, men clung to railings and prayed quietly in their own language. They were sure this journey was punishment in disguise. The ocean stretched endlessly, a cold void between the ruins of Europe and the unknown continent ahead. When they finally saw the coastline, a faint strip of light on the horizon, it felt unreal. America had been only a word, a rumor carried by propaganda and fear. Now it stood before them, vast and indifferent. The train that took them inland rolled for hours past forests, fields, and small towns that seemed untouched by war. Through the windows, they saw children playing, farmers working, houses standing whole and bright in the winter sun. They could not understand how such a place could exist while their own homeland burned. When the train stopped, they were herded toward a gate marked by barbed wire. Yet even then, something was different. The guards were young, quiet, and polite. They gave instructions through interpreters, handed out blankets, and pointed to wooden barracks that smelled of fresh sawdust, not decay. That evening, the prisoners were brought to a mess hall. Steam rose from metal trays filled with stew, bread thick and warm, coffee that tasted of roasted earth and comfort. Karl took his first sip and felt his throat tighten. He had expected cruelty, yet here was food better than any he had eaten at the front. The men sat in silence, chewing slowly, glancing toward the guards as if waiting for the trick to reveal itself. None came. Later, in the barracks, someone whispered that it was only the beginning, that the Americans were softening them before the real punishment began. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing changed. They worked. They slept. They were treated like soldiers, not animals. The guards followed strict routines, their commands firm but never cruel. There were rules, inspections, even entertainment. Radios played faintly in the evenings. Sometimes across the camp yard, the sound of jazz drifted through the cold air, strange music, unmilitary and free. It unsettled them more than shouting would have. The first time Karl saw the library, he thought it was a mistake. Books in German, newspapers printed for the prisoners, even grammar guides for those who wanted to learn English. Inside, men sat quietly, turning pages, their faces lit by a calm they didn't understand. It was as if the Americans wanted them to think, to remember, to feel. For men trained to obey without question, this was the most dangerous thing of all. As the months passed, suspicion began to dissolve. The camp became a world of its own, governed by rules that felt almost fair. The prisoners built furniture, repaired roads, harvested crops for nearby towns. They were paid small wages, enough to buy cigarettes or stamps. Letters arrived from home, sometimes weeks late, their edges frayed by censors' blades. The words inside spoke of ruins, hunger, and silence. Carl read one from his sister. Their town had been bombed, their father missing. He folded the paper carefully and looked around at the camp. Its clean paths, its orderly fences, its guards who nodded when he passed, and wondered which side of the wire truly held the prisoners. There were moments when he forgot the war altogether. In spring, wildflowers grew beyond the fence, and the men watched them sway in the breeze. Birds nested in the tower rafters. The world outside the wire seemed distant, almost imaginary. Inside, time stretched endlessly, neither punishment nor freedom. Some of the men began to smile again, their faces softening, their hands steady. Others felt guilt settle heavier with every passing day. Egan, writing in secret, on scraps of paper, he described the faces of the guards, the taste of American bread, the sound of laughter echoing from the barracks at night. He wrote of confusion, how kindness could wound more deeply than hate. He remembered the things he had seen in the East, the orders he had obeyed, the eyes of those who never returned. He had thought capture would end his war, but it had only changed the battlefield. Now the struggle was within him. Sometimes, at dusk, he would stand near the fence and look toward the guard tower. The light there burned softly against the darkening sky. Beyond it, the fields rolled into shadow, peaceful and endless. He tried to imagine what the Americans thought as they watched him, if they saw a man or only an enemy behind wire. Once, a guard dropped a cigarette near the fence and gestured for him to take it. Carl hesitated, then reached through the strands. Their fingers brushed briefly, and for that moment, the war felt impossibly far away. Nights were quiet. The men spoke little now, their anger dulled by routine and strange comfort. Dreams came heavy, filled with faces from home, the dead and the living mixed together. Carl often woke before dawn, listening to the soft creak of bunks, the distant hum of the generator. Outside, frost glittered on the wire. It looked almost beautiful. He thought of the cities burning across the ocean, of mothers searching the rubble for sons, and wondered how a world capable of such destruction could also hold this small island of decency. The realization came slowly, like light creeping through fog. The Americans were not what they had been told. They were not barbarians, not monsters, not the destroyers of culture and faith. They were men, tired, imperfect, capable of cruelty but choosing restraint. And that choice, more than any victory on the battlefield, was what broke the prisoner's certainty. To be treated with dignity when one expected only scorn was more disarming than defeat itself. Months turned to years. Some prisoners volunteered to work on local farms, side by side with civilians. They mended fences, harvested crops, learned fragments of English. American children waved as they passed on trucks. In the evenings, they returned to the camp, tired but somehow lighter. They began to see the guards not as conquerors, but as keepers of a fragile peace. The boundaries blurred. The war outside no longer seemed to define them. When the war finally ended, the announcement came through the loudspeakers on a warm summer afternoon. The men stood still, listening to the crackling voice reading words that felt unreal. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was gone. There was no cheer, no relief, only silence. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the ground. The war that had consumed their youth had ended while they stood behind American wire, alive but unsure of what life meant now. Repatriation came slowly. Many didn't want to leave. They feared the ruins waiting across the ocean, the hunger, the shame. They feared facing families who no longer believed in the cause they had fought for. When Carl's name was called, he hesitated at the gate, looking back at the camp one last time. The fences glinted in the sun, but beyond them, he saw something he hadn't felt in years: calm. On the ship home, the sea stretched endless and quiet, just as it had before. But now, it carried them not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as men who had glimpsed something beyond war. They had seen that even in victory, humanity could remain intact, that kindness, unexpected and undeserved, could be stronger than fear. Years later, when Carl would tell his grandchildren about the war, he never spoke of battles or medals. He spoke instead of the camp, the meals, the books, the music that drifted over the wire. He spoke of the moment he realized his enemy had saved his soul, and in his memory, the barbed wire no longer divided men. It marked the place where hatred had ended and understanding had begun. When the train doors opened, the air of Germany struck them like the past itself. It was heavy with coal smoke and ruin. The station was half collapsed, the windows shattered, the platform littered with cinders and ash. They stepped out in silence, their uniforms replaced by plain gray coats, tags around their necks marking them as repatriated. No flags awaited them, no crowds, only the quiet wind moving through a land that no longer resembled home. The cities were ghostly. Streets once lined with shops and trams had become corridors of rubble. Churches stood roofless, bells melted into silence. The smell of burned stone clung to everything. They had left America's clean barracks and ordered days. They returned to a country that had forgotten the meaning of order. Carl walked through what remained of his hometown. The house where he had grown up was a blackened shell. The river ran slow and brown, choked with debris. His sister, he learned, had survived. His father had not. In those first weeks of return, there were whispers, men who spoke of the camps in America in voices barely above a breath. They said the guards had treated them well, that they had been fed, even educated. To say such things aloud was dangerous. There was pride still, brittle and defensive. Many refused to believe that their captors had shown mercy. They said it was a lie, an attempt to humiliate them further. Carl said nothing. He simply worked, rebuilding walls, clearing debris, moving through the dust of what had once been a country. But at night, when the city quieted and the only sound was wind through broken rafters, he thought of the camp, the smell of coffee, the steady hum of generators, the faces of Americans who had looked at him without hatred. He thought of the guard who had once handed him a cigarette through the wire, and how that single gesture had carried more power than any uniform. It was not forgiveness, it was recognition. In those moments, he understood that what he had seen was not weakness, but strength. The strength of those who refused to become what they fought. Years passed. Germany changed. The ruins became foundations. Roads were cleared, factories rebuilt. A new flag rose over a divided land. For many, the memory of captivity faded into the background noise of survival. But for men like Carl, it lingered quietly. When he walked past construction sites, he noticed the scaffolding built with the same precision he had learned repairing barracks in the American camp. When he heard jazz on a radio, he felt a strange nostalgia, a sound that had once drifted through barbed wire under a foreign sky. He began to write again, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. In notebooks that no one else read, he described the paradox that haunted him, how defeat had taught him the meaning of decency, how captivity had given him back a sense of self. He wrote of the silence between enemies, of the small acts of kindness that had survived the machinery of war. These pages, fragile and private, were his own attempt to reconcile the world he had seen with the one he had helped destroy. In 1949, a letter arrived from across the ocean. It was from one of the American guards, Private John T. Miller, now a farmer in Iowa. The letter was short, written in careful English. "I sometimes think of the camp," it said. "We did what we could. I hope you are alive and well." There was no anger, no triumph. Only a line that struck Carl more deeply than any speech. "Maybe someday we'll meet again without fences between us." He folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of his notebook. It became his most valued possession, not a medal, not a photograph, but a simple message that the world could heal. For years, he never replied. He didn't know what to say. How could one explain to an enemy that captivity had been his first lesson in freedom? Decades later, when he finally traveled to America as an old man, the world had changed again. The war was history now, blurred by documentaries and museums, its edges softened by distance. He visited the site of his old camp. The fences were gone, the towers dismantled. A plaque stood in the grass, weathered by time. It bore a few simple words. "Here's to the camp for prisoners of war, 1944 to 1946. May we remember that even in conflict, humanity endures." He stood there for a long time, the wind moving gently across the open field. The land was quiet, peaceful. Children played in the distance. He could still see, in his mind, the shapes of the barracks, the faint outline of the wire against the horizon. It was all gone, but the memory of it lived in the soil, in the air, in the quiet dignity of the place. As he walked back toward the road, he realized that the camp had never truly been a prison. It had been a mirror, a reflection of what people chose to be when power was in their hands. The Americans had chosen restraint, and in doing so, they had done something extraordinary. They had preserved the idea of civilization in a time when the world had nearly lost it. That thought stayed with him until his final years. He told it once, softly, to his grandson, that the war had taken his youth, but his captors had given him something he had not known he needed: faith in humanity. He said it without pride, without sentiment, simply as fact. The boy listened, not fully understanding, as children rarely do, but he would remember the words long after. When Carl Hoffman died, the letter from Iowa was found in his desk, still folded between the yellowed pages of his journal. His daughter placed it in his coffin. The handwriting had faded, the ink pale and uncertain, but the message remained clear. Two enemies had lived long enough to understand one another. And so the story came full circle. A German soldier, shaped by war and redeemed by compassion, carried across an ocean not by hatred, but by the fragile endurance of decency. The war had ended long ago, yet its quietest lesson endured, that in the worst of times, it is not the victors who define humanity, but those who refuse to abandon it. If you stood now where those barracks once stood, you would see nothing but an open field. No white, no guards, no soldiers. Only grass moving gently in the wind. Yet beneath that soil lies the memory of men who discovered that even enemies can teach mercy. The land remembers what they learned, that dignity is not a gift but a choice, and sometimes the defeated understand it best. In the decades that followed, memory itself became another battlefield. The war was over, but the story of how it was remembered divided nations, families, even generations. For some Germans, the years spent behind American fences became a secret shame, something unspoken, wedged between pride and guilt. For others, it was a revelation that quietly shaped the post-war conscience of a broken nation. The men who had seen America's restraint carried that image like a small flame into the ruins of their homeland. They had learned that strength was not only the will to fight, but the will to stop fighting. In the 1950s, West Germany struggled to rebuild itself from rubble and silence. The Marshall Plan poured in money and machines, but the soul of the country remained fractured. There were too many ghosts, too many unspoken questions. Yet in the background, men who had once worn gray uniforms began teaching, building, governing. They were ordinary, disciplined, determined. and some of them carried memories of those distant American camps, where order had not come through fear, but through respect. It was a quiet influence, invisible in speeches, but alive in actions. They had learned to line up for food without being shouted at. They had learned that discipline could exist without brutality. They had learned that rules could protect, not destroy. For many, those lessons took root deeper than the old slogans of loyalty and blood. They had seen a different kind of power, one that did not demand worship. And in their modest, stubborn way, they carried it into the new Germany that emerged from the ashes. Karl became a teacher. He never spoke much about the war, except when asked. When he did, he described not battles, but silence. The sound of snow falling in the Ardennes, the hum of the generator in an American camp, the way men spoke less when they were treated as humans. He said that the war had taught him two things: how easy it was to destroy, and how difficult it was to remain decent. His students didn't always understand. To them, the war was already distant, a shadow receding beyond their own horizons. But when he walked the hallways of his school, hearing the laughter of children, he sometimes thought of those barracks where laughter had once felt impossible. He thought of the night he had stood near the fence, looking at the guard tower light, and realized that the enemy he had been taught to hate was capable of compassion. That single understanding had changed everything. Across the ocean, the Americans who had guarded those camps lived their own quiet lives. Many never spoke about their service. It seemed small compared to the battles raging elsewhere. But some remembered. They remembered the faces of prisoners who were no longer proud, the long silences, the slow thaw of fear into civility. They remembered sharing cigarettes, trading a few words of broken German, realizing that the men behind the wire were not fanatics, but boys caught in the machinery of a collapsing empire. One former guard, interviewed in the 1980s, said simply, "We had the chance to show them who we were." And I think we did. It was not heroism that defined that moment, but restraint. It was an act of will, quiet and uncelebrated. Yet it stood in contrast to the brutal logic of total war that had consumed the world. When the Americans chose decency over vengeance, they did something extraordinary. They preserved the moral difference that justified their struggle. The power to punish had been absolute. They chose instead the power to endure without cruelty. History often celebrates the victories of armies, but rarely the victories of conscience. The treatment of German prisoners in America was not perfect. There were mistakes, indignities, moments of neglect, but in the larger picture, it was a triumph of discipline and humanity. In a war defined by extermination and hate, it proved that mercy was still possible. The Geneva Convention was more than paper. In those years, it became a living code. The camps were inspected, food distributed according to law, work assigned fairly. To the Americans, it was bureaucracy. To the Germans, it was revelation. Order without terror, authority without humiliation. It was something their own nation had long forgotten. In later years, sociologists would trace a subtle current of influence from those camps to the civic life of West Germany. Many ex-prisoners joined local councils, police forces, civil service. They had lived under two systems, one of fear, one of fairness, and they knew which one worked. The transformation was not sudden, nor was it total, but it was real. Out of the experience of defeat grew a culture that valued restraint, compromise, legality. It was as if the discipline of captivity had been rewritten into the DNA of a new democracy. Karl, growing old, understood that history never moves in straight lines. The men who had fought, the men who had killed, were also the ones who rebuilt and reconciled. There were no pure heroes, no pure villains, only choices made in impossible times. Yet he believed that in the moral wreckage of the 20th century, one truth had survived. Humanity, once revealed, cannot be unlearned. Sometimes he dreamed of the camp again, not as a prison, but as a place suspended outside of time. He dreamed of the morning mist over the yard, the faint sound of a bugle in the distance, the smell of bread from the mess hall. In those dreams, the fences were still there, but they no longer held him. They framed a memory of what men can become when they choose restraint over revenge. In the final years of his life, Carl received another letter from America. This one was written by the son of the guard who had written to him decades earlier. The handwriting was careful, the English polite. The letter said, "My father spoke of you. He said he learned something important from those years, that dignity must be shared or means nothing. He told me to find you, to tell you that he was grateful for your humanity too." Carl read the letter slowly, his hands trembling. He looked out the window at the quiet street below, at the children walking home from school. The sun was low, the air filled with the scent of autumn. He realized, as he folded the letter, that time had done what war could not. It had turned enemies into witnesses of the same truth. When he died, his papers were found neatly stacked in a wooden box. Among them were his wartime journals, his teaching notes, and both letters from America. His daughter donated them to a small museum dedicated to reconciliation. Years later, a visitor reading those pages would write in the guest book, "Dash, it is strange that kindness can be more revolutionary than any battle." The story of the German prisoners in America faded from textbooks, overshadowed by greater horrors, larger victories. But for those who lived it, it remained a quiet turning point, a reminder that even when nations descend into madness, individuals can still choose sanity. If you walk today through the grounds where those camps once stood, there is nothing left to see. The fences are gone, the towers long dismantled. Grass covers the outlines of old foundations. Birds nest where floodlights once glared. The wind moves through the trees with the same sound it made then, a low, patient whisper. Beneath it, the earth keeps its memory. In that silence lies the proof that mercy, once shown, endures longer than fear. The men who came as enemies left as witnesses to something greater than victory. They saw that power can be tempered with compassion, that justice without cruelty is still strength, and that even behind barbed wire, humanity can survive. History will remember the war for its destruction, its cruelty, its unimaginable scale of loss. But hidden beneath those vast tides of violence are moments like these, small, fragile, and profoundly human. They're the threads that keep the story of civilization from unraveling completely. The war ended, but the lesson did not. It lives in every act of restraint, every choice to see the enemy as human. It whispers across generations that dignity is not given by flags or borders, but by the courage to remain decent when decency seems impossible. The German soldiers who walked through the gates of American camps expecting hell found, instead, a glimpse of something that would outlast empires. They found proof that mercy is not weakness. They found the quiet strength of a people who had nothing to prove except that they were still human. And in the end, that was the most powerful victory of all. Years passed, and the men who had lived that strange chapter of the war began to fade from memory. They grew old quietly, their stories scattered across 2 continents. Half in German towns rebuilt from ashes, half in American farms where the ghosts of their captors had long been replaced by new generations who no longer remembered the war except through films and photographs. Yet history does not disappear. It settles deep into the soil, waiting for someone to listen. In the 1970s, a young historian from Hamburg began searching for survivors of the American camps. His father had been one of them, though he rarely spoke of it. The historian traveled across Germany, notebook in hand, recording fragments of a story that few still care to tell. He met men living quiet lives, teachers, craftsmen, tailors, engineers. None called themselves heroes, yet all shared a certain gentleness, an old-fashioned politeness that set them apart. When he asked them about their captivity, Their eyes softened. They spoke not of hunger or humiliation, but of confusion, of kindness, of the slow unraveling of hatred. One of them told him, "When I was captured, I thought my life was over. But in America, I learned that it was beginning again." Another said, "It was strange. Our guards had power, but they didn't need to show it. That taught me more than any sermon." The historian filled pages with these memories, their quiet honesty striking him more deeply than any battle account. When he published his book years later, it sold modestly. The public wanted stories of heroism and suffering, not moral paradox. But among those who read it were educators, clergy, and veterans who recognized in its pages something vital, a truth about the thin thread of humanity that had survived even amid the machinery of total war. One reviewer wrote, "Perhaps this is the most dangerous kind of story, the one that reminds us that even enemies can be good men." In America, a similar rediscovery was taking place. In small towns across the Midwest and the South, local historians began uncovering forgotten archives, photographs, letters, and artifacts from the POW camps that had once stood at the edges of their communities. What they found astonished them. There were photos of prisoners playing soccer, of choirs performing Christmas hymns in both languages, of guards and captives standing together, awkwardly smiling, as if the world had paused for a moment to remember it was still human. Some towns held reunions. Former prisoners, now elderly, returned to the places of their captivity. They walked through wheat fields where barracks had once stood, shaking hands with the sons and daughters of the guards who had once watched over them. There were tears, laughter, silence. Reporters wrote about it briefly, calling it a curious reconciliation. But for those who stood there, it was something deeper than curiosity. It was the quiet closing of a circle that had begun in the cold of 1944. Carl's grandson, now a man himself, attended one of these ceremonies. He had grown up hearing fragments of the story, pieces of memory that his grandfather had shared before his death. But it was only when he stood on that American field, under a vast and peaceful sky, that he understood what it meant. The past was not a thing that ended. It was a living current running through generations. He watched the veterans, American and German alike, sit together under a white tent, trading photographs and shaking hands with the tenderness of men who had outlived hate. Later, he would write in his own journal, "I saw forgiveness today, and it looked nothing like weakness. It looked like peace." The documentaries that followed tried to capture that feeling. The faded photographs, the letters written in two languages, the trembling voices of old men recalling how the enemy had shown them mercy. But no film could fully explain it, because it was not a story of spectacle, but of restraint. It was not about victory or defeat, but about the quiet endurance of decency when the world had gone mad. By the end of the century, the fields where the camps had stood were indistinguishable from the land around them. Nature had reclaimed what war had built. Grass grew over the outlines of foundations. Trees rose where guard towers once cast shadows. Only small plaques remained, modest and easily overlooked, engraved with words few stopped to read. Yet those words mattered. They said that here, in the heart of a violent century, humanity had refused to die. Every generation faces its own kind of darkness. Each must decide what it will do with power, whether to wield it for destruction or to restrain it for the sake of something larger. The Americans who guarded those prisoners did not see themselves as moral philosophers. They were soldiers following orders. But their restraint became a kind of philosophy nonetheless, a living example that even in war, there are lines that must not be crossed if civilization is to survive. And the Germans who lived through that mercy carried it back to a land that desperately needed moral oxygen. Their memories became small seeds of sanity in a landscape of ashes. Many never spoke of it openly, but it lived in the way they treated their neighbors, in the patience they showed their children, in the quiet belief that power should always serve dignity, not destroyed. It was a lesson bought at terrible cost. Millions had died, and whole cities had vanished before such a truth could be rediscovered. But in those camps, hidden behind fences, watched by guards, far from the eyes of the world, a fragment of civilization had survived. It had not come from speeches or politics, but from ordinary men doing their duty with extraordinary restraint. As the century turned, the last of the veterans began to fade. Their graves stretched from Bavaria to Kansas, from Bremen to Texas, each one a silent echo of the same lesson. On headstones and memorials, the wars were listed by dates and ranks. But between those lines lived the unspoken legacy of their generation, that humanity, once shown, outlives all ideologies. In museums and classrooms, the story of the POWs in America is often told as a curiosity, a footnote to the vast machinery of war. But perhaps it is something more. Perhaps it is the quiet proof that the line between civilization and barbarism is drawn not by victory or defeat, but by the choices made when no one is watching. The men who entered those camps in chains left them with something greater than freedom. They left with a vision of what a world without hate might look like. And though that vision was fragile, carried only in memory and in silence, it endured. Today, when one stands on those same grounds, it is impossible to tell that they were once filled with wire and watchtowers. The air is still, the fields wide and golden under the sun. Yet if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the footsteps on gravel, the distant murmur of voices, the clink of metal trays in a mess hall. And beneath it all, quieter than the wind, the heartbeat of an idea that refused to die. That mercy, even toward the defeated, is the truest measure of strength. The war had taken everything from them: homes, youth, certainty. But in captivity, they had been given one thing in return: a glimpse of humanity unbroken. It was a fragile gift, but it was enough to change how they saw the world. And that is why, long after the flags have faded and the monuments have crumbled, this story still matters. Because somewhere between the wire and the open sky, between defeat and compassion, men learned that decency could survive even the end of the world in the years that followed. The story of the German prisoners in America drifted into the quiet corners of history, never denied but rarely told. Wars have a way of glorifying battles and forgetting what happens after them. The victors remember their triumphs. The defeated bury their shame. But the truth of those years, the strange, humane chapter written in the heart of war, remained like a whisper beneath the noise of history. By the time the 21st century began, few who had lived it were still alive. Their children and their children's children inherited only fragments: letters, photographs, journals with faded ink. But memory has a way of resurfacing when the world needs it most. As the new century unfolded, full of its own conflicts and divisions, historians began to rediscover that quiet miracle of restraint that had once occurred far from the front lines. They opened the archives and found documents written by hand in 1944, inspection reports noting clean facilities, medical records showing adequate rations, lists of books provided to prisoners, and typed correspondence from American officers insisting that even enemies must be treated with dignity. For some researchers, these were mere bureaucratic curiosities, but for others, they were proof that even in the age of fire and steel, there had been men who remembered the law of decency. Old photographs began to appear in museums, grainy black and white images of smiling prisoners working in fields, building furniture, playing soccer behind barbed wire. To the modern eye, they looked almost unreal. In a century that had produced Auschwitz and Dresden, Nanking and Stalingrad, it seemed impossible that such a thing could coexist, compassion amid carnage. And yet it had. Historians debated why. Some said it was practical, that America, with its wealth and resources, could afford to treat prisoners well. Others argued it was moral, a deliberate decision to uphold ideals when the temptation to abandon them was overwhelming. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. The German prisoners who returned home after the war carried with them a vision of order and restraint that would quietly shape the moral backbone of post-war Europe. In 2005, a film crew traveled through what had once been Camp Algona in Iowa, recording interviews with locals and surviving prisoners. The site was now a flat expanse of farmland, a few foundations visible beneath the grass. But as they filmed, one of the surviving German veterans, now frail and slow, placed his hand on the soil and said, "This ground gave me back my soul." His words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. The crew said nothing. There was nothing to add. It is easy, looking back, to see World War II only in terms of fire and destruction, to measure it in body counts and maps. But the deeper truth is quieter. It lies in the spaces between atrocities, in the moments when men chose not to become monsters. The POW camps of America were not paradise. They were prisons, after all, but within their fences, something rare had survived. The simple decision not to answer cruelty with cruelty. In the decades after the war, many of the Americans who had served as guards said that the experience changed them as well. They had gone to war expecting to face evil. Instead, they found frightened young men who, stripped of their uniforms, looked and spoke like themselves. For some, that realization shattered the illusion of righteous hatred. For others, it deepened their belief that moral strength meant holding the line between justice and vengeance. The memory of that restraint would echo faintly through later conflicts. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, officers trained in the aftermath of the Second World War carried with them the unspoken lesson of the camps, that how one treats the defeated reveals more about the victor than about the vanquished. It was a fragile inheritance, often broken, often forgotten, but it never disappeared entirely. Back in Germany, the story of the prisoners became part of the private memory of families. Grandfathers told their grandchildren about the time they saw jazz records in a prison library or tasted American chocolate for the first time. They spoke of kindnesses so small they seemed absurd against the backdrop of war. A cup of coffee, a shared cigarette, a nod from a guard. Yet these were the moments that stayed with them the longest. They were reminders that beneath the machinery of ideology, humanity had continued to breathe, quietly, stubbornly. By the 2010s, researchers studying the moral reconstruction of post-war Germany began to speak of the transatlantic echo, the subtle influence of American captivity on German democratic values. In letters, interviews, and memoirs, former prisoners describe how the fairness and predictability of camp life, the idea that even enemies had rights, had left an imprint deeper than they realized at the time. It was not a grand conversion, not propaganda, but a lived experience of what civilization could look like when it refused to descend into revenge. One scholar wrote, "The lesson of the POWs was not in what they endured, but in what they were allowed to witness. A functioning moral order in a world gone mad." And that, perhaps, is what made the story endure. It was not about pity. It was about example. It showed that mercy could exist not as weakness, but as strength in its most disciplined form. In 2018, on the site of one of the largest POW camps in Texas, a small memorial ceremony was held. The attendees were few: local historians, descendants of guards and prisoners, a handful of veterans. The air was warm and still. The last surviving German prisoner, a man of 97, was helped to the podium. His voice was thin, his accent softened by decades abroad. "I came here as an enemy," he said, "and I left as a man who believed again in mankind. The Americans had every reason to hate us, but they chose not to, and that choice saved me." He paused, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to sink. "We live in a world that forgets easily," he continued. "But I tell you this, What I saw here was civilization, not in the cities or the machines, but in how one man treats another when he doesn't have to. The audience stood in silence. There were no applause, no speeches after. The old man sat down, his hands trembling slightly. Behind him, the American and German flags stirred faintly in the wind. That evening, as the light faded across the empty fields, the sound of crickets filled the air. The camp was gone, but the memory lingered, woven into the quiet rhythm of the land. The men who had lived it were almost all gone, yet their story remained, passed down in fragments, in whispers, in photographs yellowed by time. Perhaps that is how history endures, not in monuments or textbooks, but in the fragile continuity of human decency. The world changes, nations rise and fall, wars return in different forms. But the lesson remains the same. The measure of power is not in destruction, but in restraint. The German soldiers who once marched into captivity expecting cruelty found something stronger than fear waiting for them. They found order without hatred, discipline without humiliation, justice without revenge. And in that discovery lay a truth that outlasted every ideology of the 20th century. To this day, when historians walk the grounds where those camps once stood, they often describe an uncanny stillness. The past seems close there, not in the violence of memory, but in its calm. The air holds a kind of dignity, as if the land itself remembers what was once chosen upon it. That even when surrounded by barbed wire, men can choose to remain human. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of that forgotten chapter. It teaches that compassion does not erase war, but it redeems something of the world that war tries to destroy. It reminds us that the smallest acts of decency can echo across generations. It proves that mercy, once given, does not vanish. It becomes the seed of everything that might save us when the darkness returns. The men who lived through it are gone now, their voices fading into history. But the lesson they carried still waits, steady and patient, like light beneath the soil, ready to rise again whenever the world forgets what humanity looks like. The wind moved slowly through the grass, bending each blade as if time itself were breathing. The land was quiet now, so quiet that one could almost hear the past beneath the soil, the footsteps of men long gone, the echo of a gate closing behind them. The fences had disappeared decades ago, the barracks torn down, the towers dismantled. Yet something of them remained. It was not visible, not tangible, but it lingered in the silence, in the way the horizon seemed wider here, the way the air carried a faint weight of memory. Every war leaves its scars, not only on the ground, but on the soul of those who survive it. The great battles of the Second World War are carved into history in names and numbers. Stalingrad, Normandy, Okinawa, Dresden. But between those thunderclaps of destruction existed moments so small that history nearly lost them, moments when mercy, rare and fragile, refused to vanish. The story of the German prisoners in America was one of those moments. It was not a grand narrative of heroism or conquest. It was something quieter, a testament to restraint, to the moral discipline that separates civilization from barbarism. When the war ended, the world wanted to forget. The victors turned their eyes to rebuilding, the defeated to survival. But within thousands of German homes, small memories endured of order where chaos might have been, of fairness where vengeance was expected. The men who had lived through that experience carried it not as trauma, but as proof that decency could exist even in defeat. They spoke little of it, yet it lived in their gestures, in their patience, in the way they raised their children to distrust fanaticism. For decades, historians dismissed those camps as administrative footnotes, minor details in a war defined by horrors far greater. But the truth of human history is not built only on battles and treaties. It is also built on choices that seem insignificant at the time. A guard sharing a cigarette, a prisoner returning a salute, a command given without cruelty. Each act, small and quiet, formed the invisible architecture of something greater, a moral resistance against the logic of hate. In the archives of the Red Cross, there are still records of those days, meticulous reports detailing meals served, letters delivered, medical supplies distributed. The handwriting is precise, almost cold in its bureaucracy, yet between the lines lies something extraordinary, evidence of conscience in an age of destruction. The numbers tell a different story than the war itself. Over 370,000 German prisoners passed through camps in America. The vast majority returned home alive. In a century where millions perished in camps built for death, that simple fact stands like a monument of quiet defiance. The years softened the sharp edges of memory. By the late 20th century, both nations had changed beyond recognition. Germany rebuilt itself from ruin, learning to balance remembrance with renewal. America, too, moved on, its citizens often unaware of the strange role their land had played in redeeming a small fragment of the humanity the war had tried to erase. But the traces remained, in photographs tucked into drawers, in postcards written in 2 languages, in the soil of fields that had once held wire. For those who came after, it was difficult to comprehend how such decency could coexist with the brutality of war. How could the same world contain both Auschwitz and Algona, both death marches and humane captivity? Perhaps that was the truest reflection of humanity, that it is never one thing or the other, never wholly light or dark, but a shifting balance of both. The existence of mercy does not erase cruelty, but it proves that cruelty does not have to win. When the last of the former prisoners died, the story should have ended. But it didn't. It continued quietly through their descendants, through the American families who still kept their father's journals of the camps, through the German families who still held the strange gratitude of having been treated as men in a time when being human seemed impossible. Their children grew up in peace, free to take for granted what their parents had learned behind barbed wire. That dignity is not a luxury, but the foundation of any world worth rebuilding. In the early 2000s, a group of students at an American university found a box of undeveloped film in a local museum's basement. When they restored it, images emerged. German prisoners repairing a fence, laughing with American guards, posing in front of a hand-painted sign that read, "Work in Peace." The photographs were grainy, fragile, almost dreamlike. But within them was a truth more powerful than any speech. The past was not gone. It was simply waiting to be seen again. A decade later, those images appeared in an exhibition titled, "Mercy Behind the Wire Dash." Visitors walked in silence between the photographs, their footsteps muffled on the museum floor. There were no captions of heroism, no propaganda, only faces, young, tired, human. American, German, 2 sides of the same species, separated by war, but momentarily united by decency. People lingered before the final image, an empty field under an open sky, taken after the camp had been dismantled. The curator had chosen it deliberately. It showed nothing, and in that emptiness, it showed everything. Perhaps that is the final truth of it. The power of humanity lies not in monuments or declarations, but in absence, in the violence that did not happen, in the cruelty that was withheld. Civilization is not built by heroes alone, but by the countless unnamed souls who, in the silence of their duties, choose to be kind when they could be cruel. The war taught many lessons, but few as enduring as this. That power without restraint becomes barbarism, and restraint in the face of hatred becomes strength. The Americans who guarded those camps did not win the war by their mercy, but they preserved the reason the war was worth winning. They proved that a nation's greatness is measured not by its victories, but by its conduct when victory is assured. Now, more than 70 years later, the world has changed beyond their imagining. Technology has replaced telegrams. Nations have risen and fallen. Yet the same questions remain. What does it mean to be civilized? What does it mean to hold power responsibly? What does it mean to see humanity in the face of the enemy? The answers lie, perhaps, not in the pages of history books, but in the fields of Iowa, Texas, and Georgia, in the quiet American soil where German soldiers once learned what mercy looked like. There, under the open sky, the fences are gone, but the lesson remains. And if one were to stand there now, at dusk, the air still warm from the day, one might feel the weight of that silence, the kind that holds memory, not sorrow. The grass moves gently in the wind, the same wind that once carried orders, prayers, and songs in two languages. Nothing of the war remains, yet everything does. The land remembers, even when people forget, because history's true monuments are not built of stone. They are built of choices, moments when men decide what kind of world they wish to leave behind. In those American camps, far from the front lines, among men who had once been taught to hate, a different kind of victory was won. Not a victory of arms, but of conscience. And perhaps that is all that endures. The knowledge that mercy, even once, even briefly, can change the world.